Welcome to the Decoding Innovation podcast series, brought to you by the EY Nottingham Spurk Innovation Hub, where we explore the innovative technologies, business models, and ideas that are shaping the future of industries. During each episode, we meet with stakeholders at the cutting edge to discuss innovations in their space, challenges they need to overcome, and their outlook on the future.
Welcome to this episode of the EY Nottingham Spurk Innovation Hub Decoding Innovation podcast. I'm Brent Dersch. I'm your host. I'm coming to you from the EY Nottingham Spurk Innovation Hub in Cleveland. I'm here today with Kristina Skierka, who's the founder and CEO of Power for All. Kristina, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I'm ringing in today from San Francisco.
All right, excellent. So let's get started. Maybe we could start with a little bit on your background. We know that you're the founder of Power for All, but what led you to that point in your career where you founded Power for All? What were some of the experiences you had in your career along the way?
Yeah, great question. And I mean, it stretches back, so I'll try to give you the abbreviated version here. But I actually got my start working in political campaigns many years ago. And the next sort of thing on my agenda was going to be two years to 6 years in the DC penitentiary known as Capitol Hill. And I really thought life was getting a little too predictable. So I sold everything I had, bought a truck, and drove from Boulder, Colorado down to Patagonia in Argentina. And on that trip, I didn't really understand what I was seeing, but it was my first experience of energy poverty. You know, the difference between a village that had access to energy was vibrant, the electrification, the opportunity that came with that. And then the next village that maybe didn't have electricity, and seeing just how depressed the town was, how quiet it was. And it just sort of stored those memories away. But long story short, I ended up back in the United States after 2 years on the road and didn't really know which way was up. So I ended up working for a behavior change campaign in energy called Flex Your Power. So that was when California was experiencing its rolling blackouts. And it was a very interesting chance for me to see how this combination of experience I had around sort of policy and politics melded with advocacy and focused on an environmental cause like green energy or energy efficiency could make a radical difference in the future of the planet. And as a lifelong environmentalist, I just kind of sunk my teeth in. And I never actually planned to have a career in energy, but here I am 20 years later. And I guess, the real founding of Power for All came from an identified need and a gap. And so I had started a consulting firm, and I was working with a fabulous company called D-Light. They were one of the first movers in rooftop solar for developing countries. And at the time, the founders were very focused on killing kerosene, which is a noble goal. But in just the years prior to that, I'd been working with the state of California to advance the statewide energy efficiency strategic plan. And with that, there was a deep focus on zero net energy. So that means point specific. That's not what we're talking about net zero today, and the goals around 1.5. But at that time, I was bringing that understanding of what distributed generation, whether it's at a business scale, a home scale, or industrial scale, could do for the future of energy. So bringing that knowledge and working with D-Light, we really at that time were some of the first people to talk about ending energy poverty with decentralized renewables. And as we looked around us and saw some pretty dim predictions from the large institutions weren't really taking this sector seriously, there was a very evident need to start an advocacy and awareness campaign to really drive acceptance of this form of energy as being a legitimate part of the global energy system. So in brief, it really came from the sector itself. And today, it's been 10 years, 500 plus partners all working together to change the way that energy is generated, used, and paid for.
So, Kristina, you talked a little bit about your background and what led you to start up Power for All. Could you talk about the mission of Power for All, what it was designed to do. And you mentioned distributed and renewable energy. Maybe we'll start to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, happy to. So Power for All is a global campaign that's focused on accelerating the end of energy poverty by really advancing market adoption of decentralized renewable energy. So in the plainest terms, DRE means mini grids, rooftop solar. Sometimes it also includes productive use equipment. So that's appliances and other machinery that can be used to start and support small businesses in even the most remote villages in the world. But Power for All, as I mentioned, is a campaign. We are seeking a change as opposed to just being another nonprofit. We really want to accelerate the end of energy poverty. And so the goal here is market building. So we do that by raising awareness of the value of decentralized renewables, as well as really call attention to the problems with the way we've always done energy. Part two of that is really activation. So that's helping markets in these emerging economies turn on. So that means working with the existing sector to help create the environment it needs for success. Oftentimes that means local in-country coalition building across civil society, corporations, utilities, policymakers, and the like. And the last piece of that is advocacy. And that's advocacy both at a national and an international level. So in many cases, energy-based development really continues to rely on large movers of money, like multilateral development banks. And that kind of funding for many of the countries who suffer from energy poverty is essential. And it's really trying to build the understanding and support to use that money differently. And today, we still have around 750 million people without any access to energy. And that's in a day and age where I can do this interview with you several thousand miles away from a cell phone if I want. And it just doesn't make any sense. We have the technology. What we don't have is the readily available acceptance and infrastructure to quickly deploy these solutions. And that's what we're here to solve.
So you mentioned several different capabilities that would help in terms of creating distributable renewable energy. You mentioned mini grids. You mentioned rooftop solar. You mentioned the idea of different types of productive machinery. Could you unpack that a little bit just to help some of our listeners understand some of the different pieces at play here?
Sure. Well, and I have to imagine that most of your listeners live where they have plenty of access to energy and probably get irritated maybe once a year when their power goes out. Well, in reality, there's still nearly 1 billion people in the world that don't have any of that, and about 2 times that have unreliable access to energy. So you could imagine that it's difficult to build a life, to really realize your full potential as a professional or as a person if you don't know day to day where your energy is coming from. So for Power for All, our vision is a world where everybody has access to the freedom and choice and agency that comes from having a regular supply of clean power. So in order to do that, though, we actually have to engage in market transformation. So right now, the default sort of currency in the energy world is traditional grid infrastructure. So that's a centralized system, usually built in an urban center with a long set of tails that stretch out from that center. But it's a very inefficient way of distributing energy. All along the way, the farther you get from the central generation plant, oftentimes those plants are powered by fossil fuels, but the farther you get away, the more energy you lose in that transmission process. So there's losses due to theft. There's losses just due to distances and inefficient machinery. But beyond that, for us, the future is really about creating an energy system that is distributed and therefore also more democratic, meaning that we don't have to rely maybe as much on a central utility to get the power we need to change the world to be what we want it to be.
So, Kristina, one thing I love about the mission behind Power for All is, a lot of times we talk about energy, we talk about the ESG considerations of energy creation and energy distribution. And in that context, people get very hung up on the E, right, which is an important part of it. What's the environmental impact of the energy that's being generated, that's being distributed? But in this case, you've got a large emphasis on the S side of it as well. So yeah, when I think about the ESG impact of what you're doing, it's very strong from the environmental angle, the societal angle, and the governmental angle, or the governance angle. Do you want to talk maybe a little bit about how you view those different ESG aspects from a Power for All standpoint?
Well, I'm happy to. And just to be clear, Power for All's a campaign, and we did do an integrated electrification pilot, which I know we'll get to talk about today. But really, we're representing the effort of hundreds of project developers working in countries around the world to achieve the end of energy poverty. So in reflecting on that S in the ESG, environmental social governance, social impact is really all it's ever been about when it comes to energy. It's, you can't really see energy, right? You can't see electrons, they exist, but it's about what the energy is able to do. And it's very well known that the Human Development Index is highly correlated with more energy use. So those social impacts really are about creating opportunities for people to have more choice in their lives, to realize their full potential. And, I think every project developer working in this space, all of Power for All's partners, they always are looking at and tracking what those impacts are. So in some cases, it can be things like getting back 4 hours a day because you don't have to walk to the nearby village where there's one maybe battery that you can charge your phone off of, right? So that's one opportunity. But beyond that, that's the opportunity to study at night because you have light. It's also the chance to start a new business because you do have a known source of energy, whether it's a small, maybe welding service, or maybe it's a bar, because you can now afford refrigeration. So energy is really the great enabler, not only of change in people's lives, but really it's what's powering all of the sustainable development goals that we're trying to achieve by 2030.
So you mentioned this integrated electrification pilot that you've been working on. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so a number of years ago, we launched an initiative called Utilities 2.0, and that's decidedly meant to be plural and definitely the next generation. So when you look across most of the developing countries, and quite frankly, some of the developed ones, you see a pretty traditional approach to energy delivery. And some of that is technology, but it also has to do with the business system. Monopolistic, vertically integrated, risk averse, and really oftentimes focused on bottom lines instead of, again, the S, the social impact of what delivering energy can do. The future of energy is a conversation that's been going on in many countries for a number of years, but we realized that nobody had really put together a framework yet of what it would look like to bring in a utility that's been struggling to meet their provisions of service obligations to millions of unelectrified people, to bring them in as a partner and work together with the comparative advantages of a centralized system and a decentralized system to see if we can prove out a theory. The idea being that if we collaborate, we can achieve faster connections. We can achieve greater demand, so people using more energy and therefore getting greater benefits of energy access, but also improve an overall energy system's performance. So that pilot was launched in Uganda a few years back, and the great news is that we were able to prove without a shadow of a doubt that by working together and leveraging the benefits that each kind of energy system has, we can actually achieve the end of energy poverty much, much faster.
So, Kristina, you talked about some of the metrics that were in place during the pilot, the speed, the demand, the performance. How did you see those actually play out on the ground in the field in Uganda?
Yeah, well, so when we set up this pilot, we set it up in a kind of interesting way. Again, with the theory that collaboration was the essential component to success. We had several companies from the decentralized renewable energy sector that we work with come to Uganda. And so in a world where there's such a lack of energy access, in central Uganda, around the city of Kampala, which is the capital, they were about to experience an abundance, in fact, too much energy because of a new dam that was brought online. So suddenly they were in this very difficult situation of trying to figure out how do they get more uptake from local citizens, including those in more rural areas, of the energy that is soon going to be oversupplied. And beyond that, there was also a regulation put in place in the country that a certain amount of connections needed to be made every year. But oftentimes the utility, one of its core business problems is it would be forced to connect people who then wouldn't vend or wouldn't use the energy. So they've spent the capital costs on connecting a household, but they can't make that money back because the people inside the home might not actually use the energy, whether because they were nervous about it, didn't understand it, or just were constrained from a money perspective. So we picked a couple of typical sort of archetypal villages. One was a control site that already had a central transmission line through it. And the other was nearby that had no energy access at all. And in that village was where we actually ran the pilot. And so before we did anything, we had to do all of the normal things one would do, whether they're in a developed or developing country, right? You have to do environmental reports. You have to get the local citizenry on board. You have to get the local council member on board. But really, when we step back and we look at that in the context of the entire country, it's quite a stark reality. You need people acclimatized to using energy, wanting to use it, being able to pay for it. So oftentimes that means having some sort of base load, whether it is, some sort of processing plant, or maybe it's a hospital or some sort of center like that, that whatever energy provider can plan on to make sure they can at least meet their basic financial requirements. So as part of that, we look at this pilot and we looked at the approach as an ecosystem. So that meant a range of technologies. It also meant having an eye on a range of social impacts. But because an ecosystem needs to be created for effective adoption of energy, we actually also engaged in education and training, both in terms of financial literacy, in terms of bringing in a resource to help people who maybe wanted to start businesses, right, to provide some of that base for the energy providers. And it was a fascinating experience to see how local trust was an incredibly important component to the exchange of electrons. Most people don't think about it like that, but it really is everything. And so over time, what we saw were just numbers across our sort of three objectives that, I think even exceeded my own expectations, if I'm honest. So we found that the pace of access was accelerated by an average of a predicted 5 years over the business as usual approach. And so that means that oftentimes in the control site that already had a transmission line, people weren't vending, they weren't using the energy. But when we brought developers in and we built relationships with the local community, they very quickly adopted the technology and started using it and using it more. Beyond that, we also saw that growth in demand, right? Because it's better for people, especially if it's clean energy, to have more benefits, right? Use more energy. So not just enough energy, maybe to charge a light and run a fan, but in fact, to power a business or, a nearby hospital, or in some cases, even a disco. So we saw that there was a 3,000% greater demand in 1 year at our pilot site over the control site. And importantly, those sites reached the same amount of consumption in a fraction, literally 1/8 the time. And then lastly, that other part of the query for us was, could we improve an overall energy systems performance by engaging in a partnership between the utility and the decentralized renewable providers. And we found that it's actually 11% cheaper to connect people this way. But beyond that, it's a 4 times greater customer lifetime value for the utility. And that partnership showed up in many different ways. And I'm happy to explain how we work so closely in partnership, that integration.
That would be great, because we have a bit of a hypothesis here that the more disruptive the change you're trying to drive, the less likely you are to be able to do it without bringing the right ecosystem of players together. So ecosystems are a hot topic here. Would love to hear more about
Yeah,
that.
absolutely. Well, we started again doing something that was very human centric. And so when we mapped out the approach to the entire pilot, we really identified, a couple of categories where we needed partnerships. So one was the technology itself, right? So in just one example, part of the learnings in this was helping change the way a utility conceptualized design and planning. And beyond that, though, there were other things that decentralized renewable companies needed to adapt to as well. So, for example, one of the most popular meters used by many grid companies isn't compatible with a utility system. And the goal here was to create, through this ecosystem approach, like a very viable, meaningful load that would then be cost effective and quick for the utility to then ultimately connect into their transmission system. So all of these things were important, but so were the business models, right? Because none of this works if we don't make profits for both sides of the wires. And so we developed 3 business models, of which we procured some grant funding that sort of acted as if we were working off the utility's balance sheet to borrow very low interest money, which is not available to decentralized renewable companies because they're oftentimes still seen as too risky. But beyond that, use also that sort of trust, like that known brand of the utility, even all the way out in rural Uganda, to get quicker adoption and acceptance of these sometimes strange looking devices to a villager. And that made a huge difference too, but that had to happen in partnership. In addition, regulation, really important part of this. And there's a number of DRE companies that refer to themselves as rural utilities. But when you look at the level of regulation that they suffer under versus what a traditional utility does, it's just not even in the same ballpark. In fact, one of the regulatory officials that we worked with from the Ugandan utility, he would carry around this book, a list of all the regulations they had to keep in compliance with. But it was being able to work together using their trusted relationships with the regulatory authorities to really break through some of the red tape. Unfortunately, because it's still considered a bit of a new sector, unfortunately, it's still patchwork of regulations. And then just 2 last components. There's a whole component around planning and operations that begins with, high touch site surveys. We talked to over 300 people in the local village, to also sort of help create and model what we thought the size of the system should be, because it had to be scaled to meet the demand. And that's one of the most challenging things about working in energy and emerging markets is you can't really predict the level of demand. And then lastly, just the people in the process, the social impacts, the, sort of heightening the utility to think about not just the stories to be told, but the actual lives that could be changed by alternating the approach that they take to who gets electricity. And so we taught the principles of human-centric design, which was quite an awakening for the utility. And all those things put together, that level of partnership, we were matched literally toe to toe with people all along the seniority chain at the utility. And when I've talked to other people who are doing these kinds of efforts in other countries, they often said that they would get agreement from high-level MD, but none of that support or integration for changing the way they were doing business was really imbued throughout the organization. We were able to get such incredible results is because we had everybody from entry level to middle management to the highest levels of authority at the utility involved in the pilot and working side to side with decentralized renewable providers to really figure out the best way forward and see what we could do together.
So you're learning real things in the field, right? Working with microgrids, working in developing worlds. What lessons can we bring back to developed economies in terms of how we approach energy infrastructure, energy regulation, all of that? You've got to be seeing things that would have a massive impact on the world where we're sitting today.
Yeah. Well, so there's this phrase path dependency, right? And that's one of the things we're trying to disrupt. We've been locked into for almost 100 years now a traditional approach to electrification that consolidates power. And that's not just electrons, it also consolidates decision making and controls of state in many cases. So, from our point of view, the distribution of power, yes, has a social component, but even in places like California, where I live, we're needing to see more and more use of distributed resources for grid resiliency. I mean, there's no better example than what's just happened with Helene, right? I mean, entire power lines gone down. And it's quite possible that some houses, if they had independently generating power, they would be able to get news and information instead of being stranded and basically in a complete information blackout in the middle of North Carolina, right? So resiliency is really the key here. But in addition, there's some other similarities, right? I mean, as solar becomes much more the energy of choice in both developed and developing countries, those are really important resources that peak during the middle of the day. And so figuring out the storage component is really essential to all of these environments. But, to stitch it all together, we need to be thinking about energy and a global energy supply. Just because it might not all be connected by wires, this is a global effort to electrify the world in a clean way. Because quite frankly, the climate doesn't recognize the lines that we've drawn on maps. It doesn't understand the boundaries we think exist. And so, what somebody is doing with a cook stove in the DRC does affect the atmosphere and the changes we need to address with our energy system in the global north.
So thinking about this global energy ecosystem, right? Because you're right. It's very easy to look at things on a local level, a national level. When you start to look at it on a global level, how do we think about collaboration? How do we think about the sharing of both energy assets as well as the sharing of knowledge and information in that sort of a world to really achieve this sort of global energy ecosystem?
Well, there's a couple of bodies that are out there that are really significant to this endeavor. And one of them, obviously, is the International Energy Agency. And, their increased acceptance and support for these resources changes the way that people think. In fact, a recent report by them identified that the majority of new connections in developing countries will be coming from distributed resources. So over 55% are included in that. So I think having that alignment at some of the large bodies has been really helpful. In addition, a lot of the work of Power for All over the last few years has been very focused on getting greater acceptance for this kind of energy. And some of the ways that we've done that have included working as a coalition with local companies and local CSOs to get changes in national energy policies and plans so that we're actually seeing carve-outs for decentralized renewables in energy targets in countries like Ethiopia and Uganda. Now, the trick is it's also incumbent upon those countries who are basically calling on the private sector to come and help with these kinds of projects, whether it's through IPPs or what have you. They need to make it easier to do business in their countries. And so that's another thing that would be really helpful in terms of facilitating the change. But beyond that, I think it's really important that for those of us who live in places like North America, it's incumbent upon us to do everything we can to support renewables, right? Because it is a global ecosystem. And the more we buy solar, the more we support storage, the prices come down, the supply goes up. So all of this is just a really critical part of the path forward to keep us below 1.5 centigrade increase in the climate.
So, Kristina, a lot of our listeners are in the world of manufacturing, right? They're running manufacturing operations. It could be all around the world. From a manufacturing standpoint, how should some of our listeners think about the role of distributed renewable energy, right? And how it could help them both within the plant, but also the socially with the base of employees that they have it working for them.
Well, yeah, I mean, C&I, commercial and industrial, is just an area that's ripe for distributed generation. And many companies are doing that already, right? Whether it's data centers, securing their own power supply on their own mini grids that they build. It's just the right decision for really maintaining your assets and not being caught off guard by a hailstorm in Texas that you couldn't have predicted. So I think a lot of companies are already doing that just because it makes good business sense. And obviously utilities are trying to hold on to those customers by, offering special rates and that kind of thing. But beyond that, I do think there's a very powerful thought leadership story to tell here. So any company that, wants to have some sort of eco leadership platform, they'd really be well served by thinking about how they buy and the kind of power they buy, that energy that they use to power everything that they do. I mean, when you're talking about supply chain, we learned from COVID just how rough a supply chain disruption is, and one way to control those outcomes are to be in charge of your own energy source. But beyond that, we haven't gotten quite to the place that we need to in terms of community choice and being able to select the generation of your power. But if you control the means of production, which in this case, we might be talking about microhydro, or we might be talking about a solar system backed up by, a powerful battery array, that's something that resonates really well with a wide range of consumers. It's also, I think, a great way to take a stance for a company without getting in the midst of all of the political debate about fracking and oil pipelines and all of that. But, it's a really, I think, reputable form of leadership to simply make a different choice and to let your customers know about that choice that you've made.
So, thinking about the progress you've made over the past few years, you have driven a significant amount of change here, right? You're working with multiple agencies, parties to drive it. What are some of the personal lessons that you have learned in trying to affect this sort of, very, very broad change?
Yeah. Number one is humans, not electrons. Whether you're seeking funding for your work or trying to get people enrolled and excited about changing the way they're powering their countries, it all starts with a human connection. And where I've seen things go wrong is when people are pushing agendas instead of connecting with people. And I think one of the main reasons we had so much success is we really invested a lot on the upfront part of developing not just trust, but co-developing, co-designing the pilot together. That is just really essential to the success. So humans, not electrons, I think is a number one. But number two is that it's really important to communicate what you're doing. And why? Because we need a sea change in terms of the pace of access for hundreds of thousands of people around the world. And if a company or a country is having success with an alternative method, we've got to broadcast that. We have to shake up business as usual and challenge the way that we've always done business. And I think then lastly, the number one thing really from a technology point of view is we have the technology we need. We don't have to spend a bunch of money on R&D. What we need to spend the money on is deployment. And unfortunately, one of the things we've seen in our sector is upwards of $1 billion verbally committed, for example, to support mini grids, but only about 14% of that money has been released into the hands of developers who can actually create the systems that get the energy to the people. So we've got to get rid of those log jams. Otherwise, we're going to be 5 years from now and still wondering why there's still so many people sitting in the dark.
So, Kristina, you talked about 5 years out, and you've said before that you would hope that Power for All would be out of business, and so to speak, in 5 years or by 2030, because access to sustainable and affordable energy is broadly available to everybody. How do you feel about how you're tracking on that macro goal?
Well, as a global community, I think everybody's pretty aligned that there's just not enough change happening. When we launched Power for All in 2015, we did an analysis, and we did it based on the basic cost of a traditional kit to get somebody started in solar, and the very real, CAGR that companies were experiencing. And we looked at what it would take to leverage that across the entire world. And that's really the basis of Power for All. That's really why we identified these 3 areas that we've been trying to influence, right? So it's challenging business as usual through our energy access dividends work. That's where we're proving out the benefits of, especially in terms of jobs, through having access to decentralized renewables. So that was one big theme to hit. The other was what we call beyond access, right? So very much our work is centered on first connections. But in addition, as we were discussing earlier, it's really important that people are able to use more energy and benefit from additional options and choices. And then that third pillar, of course, is utilities, which is what we've been talking about today, and being seen by this sort of legacy incumbents as a partner of choice in accelerating connections. So all of that, if all of those levers of change were pulled, so that's policy, that's moving money from MDBs and getting it in the hands of developers, and finally being accepted into national energy systems, we'd be in a very different place right now. But I think the number one thing holding us up is the flow of capital. And without that, without access to money, especially lower cost money, and more support on the ground from the countries themselves to quickly put up these systems, we're going to continue to see a slow pace of change. Like I said, we've got the technology we need. We have plenty of interested developers and energy companies. But there's some other pieces of the puzzle that are really holding us back from the kind of progress we need to make.
So bringing it down to the personal level for those of our listeners who find your work really, really inspiring, what are the sorts of choices that they can make on almost on a daily basis within their homes, within their businesses, within their workplaces to help support the outcomes that Power for All is trying to drive?
Yeah, well, you can always go to powerforall.org and make a donation. That supports our work and our global team in several countries around the world. We'd be happy to consider you as a donor. But beyond that, I think it's really important that we have an aspiration to have an entire generation of kids grow up thinking that renewable energy is actually business as usual and not dirty fossil fueled power plants. That has to do with education, and it has to do with what kids see and learn in school, but also the choices that their parents make. And all of us can make a slightly different choice every day, right? Whether it's choosing to use less energy in our developed world context, or helping build the market for renewables by getting an electric car. Or getting solar for our homes, or if you have a choice in a community power plant to be able to choose wind power as opposed to traditional power. Those are all in the hands of consumers. And every time we do that, we're making renewables more visible, more normal. And that's something that I think those of us in the developed world are uniquely positioned to help with.
I love the call to action, and I want to close on that because that's such a strong point to drive home to our listeners. Kristina, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a fascinating discussion. I love the mission that you all are on at Power for All, and just I really hope that it will resonate with our listeners, and they will do what they can to support you in your future efforts.
Wonderful. Well, thanks. It's been a real pleasure. And look forward to any next time. And thanks for hosting us today.
Absolutely.
The Decoding Innovation podcast series is a limited production of the EY Nottingham Spurk Innovation Hub based in Cleveland, Ohio. For more information, visit our website at ey.com/decodinginnovation. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe, leave a review wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to spread the word.